Welcome to another hour of discussion on the Arabic Hour. We have very distinguished guests today. Each one of them would take probably the whole program to introduce their achievements. I'm very happy to have Ambassador Cass Freeman and Dr. Phyllis Beans and Dr. Joseph Gresham. Ambassador himself is a visiting scholar at the International Public Affairs International Affairs at Watson Institute, Brown University. And his areas of diplomacy, geoeconomics, geopolitics, strategy, China, and the Middle East. He served as the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He was the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Chargé d'Affaires at Interim Bangkok, Beijing. He was even at the opening relationships between China and the United States during President Nixon, as in 1972, as a major interpreter. He has several books to his credit and has been very active in diplomacy. He wrote the seminal piece on diplomacy in the Encyclopedia Britannica. We have also Dr. Phyllis Beans, and she is also a very active and a major voice for international peace and bringing issues of the Palestinians to the American public. And she is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and has contributed in 11 books, either written or edited by her. And at one time, she was shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights and in the occupied Palestinian territories. And the incredible activism and the defense of the rights of the Palestinians are synonymous with Dr. Phyllis. I know her from the days of the AAUG, the Arab American University graduates, and I know she also served on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, and now is still an international advisor for them. And I can go on and on for all the contribution. Welcome. I won't, right? And here we have also equally, last but not least, is Dr. Joseph Gresham, who is also a very established author and has done incredible work on international peace, especially being president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, co-chair of the Committee for Sane U.S.-China Policy, co-convener of the International Peace and Planet Network, and is a former vice president of International Peace Bureau. Written a number of books, number of articles, continues to be quite active and involved. So welcome to my distinguished guest. I know that today is a very difficult day for the Middle East. There's scores of civilian casualties, and the situation is absolutely getting worse by the hour, and the Palestinian in Gaza who've been incarcerated for years into an open-air prison continue to suffer, and collective punishment is being meted on them. But I'd like to begin with maybe Dr. Phyllis, if you, comment on how on earth can anybody pretend that what we are seeing today is unexpected?
I don't think we can say that it was unexpected. I think that consequences exist for, in this case, generations, decades of oppression. And while this particular attack may have been missed somehow by an incompetent set of intelligence agencies. I'm not convinced that's the case, but it's certainly possible. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't known and anticipated. It was written about. As recently as a week before, there were commentators, human rights activists, human rights organizations, Israeli organizations, journalists, people on the ground saying there is going to be an explosion if things don't change. If we look back just a little bit, in 2012, the United Nations warned the world that the situation in Gaza was going to become unlivable without what they called Herculean efforts by the international community. Well, the international community did not make a Herculean effort. It didn't make any effort at all. And in 2015, 3 years later, the UN said the same thing. And 2020 came and went. Gaza is unlivable. And yet there are 2.2 million people living there under siege for 16 years. This notion of an Israeli siege that is appropriately causing such outrage right now has been underway almost as tight as this for 16 years. So that's where I think we have to look. It's certainly the violations of international law by both sides in this case have to be condemned, but condemnation is not enough. There has to be an understanding of the root causes. Without that, we will be helpless to prevent this sort of thing from happening again.
Yeah. Ambassador, Your Excellency just made a statement a few days back saying that you liken this to a jailbreak, that the Palestinians incarcerated in an open air prison, that was so natural that they would seek to liberate themselves and escape this fate of incarceration, dispossession, and violence several times. How would you take this situation now?
Well, I think the timing is related to events elsewhere. Palestinians generally have become disgusted with the established leadership of the Palestinian Authority, which of course has nothing to do with this attack, and yet is being punished by various parties, including the EU. I think what happened was an extraordinarily skillful planning effort, apparently by a very, very small group in the newly grown military wing of Hamas. Whether Islamic Jihad was involved in this or not, I do not know. But it appears that the political leadership of Hamas was not briefed on this. In effect, the Palestinian attackers went dark, so they could not be detected by the Israelis or the Egyptians or the Iranians or others. Iran has said that it was not informed, although clearly it provided support for this. But the main point is, I think you can see from the Israeli reaction that this is not a war between Israel and Hamas, it's a war between Israel and the Palestinians.
Exactly.
The Minister of Defense in Israel has described the inhabitants of Gaza as animals. Other Israelis in the cabinet have said they plan to replicate the destruction of Dresden, which was the most horrifying firestorm of World War II. I think there are grave risks here now. First, for Israel, basically conducting what can only be described as a genocidal campaign in Gaza will cost Israel very heavily, even in the West, which has been staunchly pro-Israeli. And the United States, which is apparently backing this campaign wholeheartedly, with no reservations, talk now of combining the legislation to fund Ukrainian weapons with that for Israel to solve the political problem of opposition to the Ukraine war. The United States is also going to get tarred with complicity in a genocidal attack. This is not good for Israel, it's not good for the United States, and it's terrible for the Palestinians, who will once again suffer horribly. There is no doubt whatsoever that Israel will prevail militarily. On the other hand, this is urban warfare. And we must presume that Hamas's military wing has prepared to defend against an Israeli ground attack, and we have not seen that yet. But some people are saying this could be like Iwo Jima, or it could be like the battle for the city of Hue or Fallujah or the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. Heavy Israeli casualties are very likely. And then the final questions are, will Egypt stand by and watch civilians in Gaza be mercilessly slaughtered in the thousands? Or will there be a reaction at the popular level in Egypt that facilitates resupply or engagement in Gaza? And what will Iran do? And how great is the patience of Hezbollah, which is very different from Hamas, but has great sympathy for Hamas? So this is a war that has begun in a limited context, but it could very rapidly go region-wide. And I know that the neoconservatives in the United States now are talking up the Iranian alleged involvement in this in a way that suggests they think they've finally got the excuse they've been looking for to start a war with Iran.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Gratian, the United States has taken positions that are quite blatantly on the side of the Israelis, did not raise any questions about the context that is happening. How do you think this is going to play out in the Middle East? And some people have really even argued that this normalization effort that the US is backing and has brought Sudan, UAE, Morocco, and Bahrain into it is itself also a factor, in the sense that the Palestinians have felt that the world around them is changing, and the centrality of the Palestinian cause is now dislodged. And that some of the analysts in the region have somehow cited this as one of the issues that might have provoked what we are seeing today. How do you react to this?
I'm sorry, was that addressed to me?
Yes.
Yeah, so, the timing seems almost pretty obvious, right? The diplomacy was moving forward for a Saudi-Israeli agreement. I mean, it wasn't a slam dunk, but it was certainly moving forward. And Palestinian needs and reality, oppression, were not being addressed. So people in a desperate situation respond. I'm reminded that back in two memories come from 1981 and 1982. In 1982, we had the Israeli invasion of Lebanon with the goal of destroying the PLO, which meant basically destroying the Palestinian people as a competitor for the land of Israel-Palestine. Well, the Israelis, at least initially, prevailed militarily, but certainly the idea of Palestinian rights, of a Palestinian future, didn't end with that. And my expectation here is that with will likely be, quote unquote, a Pyrrhic Israeli military victory in Gaza, will only deepen commitments not only among Palestinians for their right to self-determination in a state, but also it's going to further undermine, further isolate Israel, and I expect also the United States, as the massive suffering which will follow, even with what we're going to see as the really gross execution of hostages and others as well. So we're in for a dark time. I think the other thing to understand, and Ambassador Friedman was talking about the danger of a widening war. I think that's very real. Netanyahu said that with this war, they were going to basically restructure the Middle East. My expectation is that restructuring will not be to Israel's benefit. And we also have this playing out in a much, if you will, wider global environment, where the Chinese are, if you will, standing back now. But as international opinion grows, opposing the war and in favor of acknowledging Palestinian rights, I think we'll see China's influence continue to grow. So I think we need to understand, the war is not in anyone's interest ultimately, and for a long time we've understood that the way forward was respecting Palestinian rights as well as those of Israel. And in the situation where you have an increasingly apartheid government, it's a terrible situation.
Yeah, Dr. Phyllis, you said very succinctly that although all the violence and escalations all predictable, but to a great extent is related to the fact that there is a solution. We've reached an internationally sanctioned agreement. Maybe it's not the best, maybe many have raised issues about it, but the solution is easy, and it really means that you have to accept the Palestinian freedom and equality as a basis for it, and to give them their own state. To what extent do you think this is still a viable solution?
I don't think the two-state solution, as it's called, or two-state solution with swaps, as is the current formulation, I don't think it's possible any longer. I think most analysts, both on the ground and outside, are looking at it and saying, whatever we think of that solution, and I was never somebody who believed it could work, but whatever one believed about it in the past, there's simply no land left for anything remotely resembling a contiguous, viable Palestinian state. I think those days are over. The issue now is not about states, it's about rights. What exists today is the functioning of a single state, meaning one government, the Israeli military, that is in control of an entire set of populations whose access to what should be the rights of all is limited based on their ethnicity, their language, their religion. So it's the definition of apartheid in international law. Ironically, of course, the Israelis use the same term. They just say it in Hebrew, hafrada, instead of in Afrikaans. The word is apartheid. Both mean separation in English. So everybody is acknowledging that's what exists. And what we're looking at now is, how is that going to change? Is there going to be a struggle against apartheid for equality for all? A very, very difficult struggle, ask the South Africans, but one that can and must be waged and won. Or are we going to allow this claim that we have to get back to the two-state solution, which was never actually on the agenda? There was never a plan for two equally sovereign states. It was always a plan for one powerful sovereign state, backed by the most powerful country in the world, the Israeli state, and a Palestinian entity, which from the beginning was never designed to have access to control of its own water, its own borders, its own entry and exit, its own electrical grid, its own airspace, nothing. It would be forcibly disarmed from outside, not allowed to have a military. It was not going to be a state at all. And now there's not really any way to have even that. So that's really not on the agenda anymore. What's on the agenda is about rights and equality. And I think that's why there's been such a powerful global movement supporting Palestinian rights, supporting the struggle against apartheid, with more and more governments now focused on that. The South African government, the Namibian government, both of whom know more than anyone else what apartheid looks like and what it takes to oppose it, and are raising in the United Nations and elsewhere the need for an internationally recognized movement against apartheid. That's what we're looking at. And this war threatens to derail much of the gains that have already been made in that movement. It's a very dangerous moment.
It is. Ambassador, you've argued that there are lots of similarities between what the Palestinians are going through and the other conflict in Ukraine. And the president of Colombia the other day said, please tell me, what's the difference between Palestine and the Ukraine, and why is the West siding so strongly and arguing for protection of Ukrainians and supporting them, and none of this has been accorded or advanced or offered to the Palestinians. How do you argue this?
Well, we have become specialists in hypocrisy and double standards. We demand self-determination for Taiwan, but have no interest in having it for Palestinians or for Kashmiris or others who are under attack. We want it for the Kurds, but not for others in the Middle East. And it just, we have no credibility on this subject at all anymore. I can agree completely with Dr. Bennis. Phyllis, you are right. This is not an issue of, sharing land between two communities. There is one state now in former Palestine. And the issue is whether all of its people will be accorded the dignity, the rights, and the access to resources that a democracy would provide. I want to make one comment, if I may, about the Saudi-Israeli normalization. That I had a conversation the other day with someone from the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is the Ministry of Propaganda. And he asserted that this would be a game changer in the Middle East. I don't think so. First of all, it would be a game changer for Mr. Netanyahu. It would be a game changer for Joe Biden in the 2024 election. It would have been. But the Saudis were never going to provide a broad normalized relationship with Israel. They were exploiting this to see what they could get. And they are quite prepared to deal transactionally with Israel. They'd like nothing more than to have Israeli tourists flood into the Red Sea resorts they're building. But that was then, and this is now. And I think a lot of the transactional possibilities, which fall short of normalization, that were on the table, are no longer there as a result of this series of events and the prospect of the murderous assault on Gaza that is about to take place. So I think we need to be realistic. The normalization process with Israel, which was conceived by the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government as a way of avoiding any need to deal with the Palestinian question, has now blown up. And the Palestinians have reminded the world very effectively that this issue of their rights cannot be ignored. There can be no region-wide peace in the Middle East without addressing this issue. So Hamas will lose militarily, but I think it will win politically in terms of its objectives.
Yeah, excellent distinction. Dr. Gresham, under international law, the occupier has a responsibility to protect the civilian and the people under its occupation. It seems like the Israelis have completely ignored and continue to ignore this and the international humanitarian law. They ignore the Human Rights Watch, the Amnesty International, even their own human rights, B'Tselem. What is the UN in all this? Why is it that the poor Palestinians are on their own in this, and that all these laws and institutions are not there at all that could come to the situation and put some pressure to stop this complete ignorance and ignoring and arrogance about how you deal with the Palestinians?
Well, you know, the United Nations is an association of governments, right? And you know, with the veto power in the Security Council, from the beginning, it was designed to advance the interests of the great powers, and the rights of the Palestinians have never been at the center of the interest or concerns of the great powers. You know, maybe to be on one side or another for a period of time in order to gain advantage over the region, but never really a commitment to the Palestinian people. I'm reminded, there was a second thought that occurred to me earlier. In 1981, before the invasion of Lebanon, I was involved in a interview with Yasser Arafat. For the most part, it was not particularly impressive. But one thing he said just really stood out, which was that it's cowboys and Indians all over again. And the Palestinians are not about to go the way of enduring a genocide. So inevitably, you have resistance, and the world has changed. We're further into a post-colonial reality, right? So the global South will one way or another have increasing influence, considerable identity with Palestinians. So again, we're in this situation where oppressive right-wing racist fascists ultimately act against the interests of the people they apparently represent. And so what we see with what Israel has done, with its the goal has long been to totally absorb all of the land of Palestine into a Jewish-dominated state, and by definition, there's resistance. It's not going to be accepted. And the U.S. thinking strategically, for a long time, it was Israel and Iran as the hammer and anvil for the United States in the region. And we're playing here imperial games in a context in which, as Fiona Hill wrote, we're in a period where Pax Americana no longer prevails. And I have to say, for the U.S., this is really a failed policy here, and it's going to redound on the American people for some time to come.
Atif, could I add one point on the UN?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I think that I agree with everything Joseph said. I think it's important to recognize the role that the UN can play and has at other periods of time. It's going to be very difficult, and I think this period we're going to see some new and enhanced challenges, if you will, of reasserting the legitimacy of the UN. But if we look at this question of Israeli apartheid and look at the model, not because the Israeli apartheid looks anything like South African apartheid, it doesn't. It's an entirely different structure. What they have in common is they both violate the international covenant against the crime of apartheid. But what's important about the role of the UN was the role that was played during the anti-apartheid struggle of the 1970s and 80s and into the 90s. The role of the Special Committee Against Apartheid and eventually the Center Against Apartheid at the UN played a huge role in helping to cohere an international movement against apartheid that played an incredibly important strategic role in overthrowing apartheid. And that's what's on the table right now. There's discussion underway among a number of governments. The South African foreign minister has, in speeches in a number of countries, has talked about the importance of challenging apartheid. And there's been interest in a number of governments of reestablishing the Committee Against Apartheid. And I think that will provide a framework for a new internationalization of this movement, that the movement for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions component of civil society work inside Palestine has set the stage for. This is a new level of that. And I think that there's enormous potential for it, which is not completely gone through this new escalation. It's going to be difficult to reclaim it, but I think that's very much one of the things that we need to be working on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people have argued, and I would be quite sympathetic to some of the arguments, is that we have delegitimized any non-violent alternative to the Palestinians. The divestment, the going to the International Criminal Court, and every country, including my country, is going wholeheartedly into trying to block the ability of the Palestinians to go to this court. So to a great extent, somehow we are suppressing any ability of the Palestinians to use a non-violent alternative. Even Chris Hedges came out and said, the Israelis have been great teachers to the Palestinians. They taught them the language of violence. That's the only language they would accept and would deal with. Any comments?
Let me make a few comments, if I may.
Yep.
First of all, I think going back to what Phyllis said at the beginning, If this is an issue of human rights, of civil rights within a single state, there needs to be a Palestinian voice for that cause. And we don't really hear that. We are still the prisoners of this outmoded concept of a two-state solution. The second point I'd like to make is that this is bound up with Islamophobia, as you can see in the reaction of the Modi government in India, which is now behaving in a truly vile fashion toward the Muslim minority in its country. But it's also bound up with a perverted and mistaken view or obsession with anti-Semitism. It wouldn't matter if the Israelis were Zoroastrians or Scientologists. The results in terms of the Palestinian reaction would be the same. This isn't a religious issue at root. It is an issue of domination by one community over another. And in this regard, it's worse than South African apartheid, which I knew very well. I mean, dealing with the South Africans when they were under apartheid, the theory there was separate development. But in theory, at least, the so-called Bantustans existed to allow various peoples in South Africa to develop their own culture and prosper accordingly. There's no such theory in the case of apartheid in Israel. The whole idea is Jewish supremacy forever and the acceptance of a subordinate role for the Palestinians. And a final note, this is, in a sense, the last gasp of settler colonialism, to go to a point that Joseph made. There will be no sympathy for the Israeli colonists, the settlers, particularly given their egregious racist comments and behavior. And I think one of the effects of this latest incident is going to be a great upsurge in emigration from Israel. Mm-hmm. People are justifiably fearful, whereas they were very complacent before. Now I think there will be recognition by more Israelis of the dilemma that their own policies have created for them and the danger to their own safety that it produces. So I think the ripple effects of this are going to be far-reaching.
Just one point, if I may. I finally found one small thing that I can disagree with Chaz, who I've so admired for so long, and that is that there is a Palestinian voice calling for a focus on the anti-apartheid movement, and it's a huge coalition, including the PLO itself, as well as the BNC, the leadership of the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement. The website is antiapartheidmovement.net, and there's a number of resources, etc. And I think what's important about it is that this is a movement that, like the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, bridges social movements and mobilization on a global level with engagement with governments that are prepared to move in this direction. So it has real potential. And I think it's something that is going to grow as we move forward.
I hope so. And if I may just respond, that voice is not very much heard. It's drowned out by the two-state solution nonsense.
Right.
And it would require an alliance between Arab Israelis, those who are Israeli citizens, second-class citizens within Israel proper, and those who are in the various discriminated categories outside Israel proper. People with no rights under occupation of the West Bank, people who are under siege in Gaza.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in with just another dynamic that I think we haven't touched on, which is what we're going to see in the coming weeks as some of the hostages are likely executed, and how that's going to play in the Western media. It will be outrageous, and our need to be able to communicate complexity in the midst of it all. One of my the people I work with here called my attention to the fact that Vivian Silver, who was a figure in Beit Salem, is among the hostages. So we're dealing with a complex situation, and I think we're going to have to find ways to address this. We will also see, I expect, that will contribute to a schism between the West and the global South. It's going to get interesting, to say the least.
Yeah,
there are apparently 30 or so Israeli hostages who are held by Islamic Jihad, with another 100 or so held by Hamas. I think the treatment under these two different organizations is likely to be different. And there is a real danger that, just as the excesses of violence that occurred at the music festival just beyond the Gaza border have turned off a lot of people who might otherwise be willing to have an open mind about this, that Palestinian misbehavior will in fact undercut the basic message that I think Hamas wanted to send, which is, we're here, don't forget us, we are not animals, we are people, and we are entitled to respect.
It goes to the question, I think, of international law and consistency, which is something very, very difficult. It is true that a people that is facing military occupation has the right to resist, including armed resistance. That also means that armed resistance must accord to international humanitarian law, the laws of war, which, among other things, prohibit attacks on civilians, killing civilians, and kidnapping civilians. So I think we need to be clear about that. There is the right of resistance. It does not include the right to kill civilians.
I have a memory of being at a conference shortly before the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I was in Spain, and it included a Ayatollah from Iran and a PLO representative. And at one point, and it also included a leader of the Algerian Revolution, who had endorsed attacks on civilians. And it was interesting. The Iranian was basically encouraging that right to attack civilians, and it was the representative of the PLO who had said, look, this is not in our interest. And I think that the continued repression of Palestinians, have driven people beyond the edge, which is not to legitimize the killing of civilians. But of course, we're going to have to remember and highlight the fact that even as Israeli civilians are being killed, I expect in much greater numbers we're going to be seeing Palestinian civilians killed in Gaza, and that has to be absolutely condemned.
Absolutely.
And Blinken, our Secretary of State, demonstrated an absolutely appalling lack of empathy when he talked about Hamas, quote, removing people in the middle of the night from their apartments, kidnapping them, beating them, taking hostages, all of which, of course, have been the standard practices of the Israeli government toward Palestinians under occupation. I mean, how you can be so blind and occupy a position like that is beyond me.
Just as we are just talking now, another complexity is emerging. The Egyptians just declared that we will be sending huge help, humanitarian help to the people of Gaza, and the Israelis bombed Rafah. To what extent is this going to escalate, and what are the implications here? Is Egypt, that has an agreement with Israel, knows pretty well they cannot remain silent, oblivious to what's going on. So if there is going to be an outcry or a world reaction to trying to starve the people of Gaza, to make them thirsty and no electricity, how would this play? Is there any expectation that the West may yield on this? Because at the moment they have given license to the Israelis by saying we defend the right, Israel has the right to defend itself. This is literally giving Israel a license to continue this incredibly insane attempt to meet collective punishment on the people of Gaza.
I think the first question is what the Egyptian response actually will be. The Egyptian government is no friend of the Palestinians. One of the questions will be whether the level of popular pressure inside Egypt is enough to bring to bear on the Sisi government a shift in policy to open the crossing into Egypt, to allow Palestinians into Egypt, which right now they are closing, their gate is closed. They are participating in the caging of Palestinians in Gaza. Whether that changes is thoroughly in the hands of social movements across Egypt, many of whose activists are still in prison under Sisi. So I think this is a very, very difficult thing for the Palestinians to have to be counting on.
No, but there is election coming in, and Sisi is not very popular. And I suppose there will be tremendous pressure from the population of Egypt that they cannot stay. And I mean, look, we saw what happened in Alexandria, and we saw previously what happened in Sinai. So to a great extent, I don't think that the Egyptians can remain oblivious or totally inactive, seeing that the people of Gaza are being slaughtered or being without water and without electricity and without food.
There will be a general reaction in the Arab world against governments that have normalized relations with Israel on the official level. And I think you're right, the major manifestation of that is likely to be in Egypt, because of the border with Gaza and because of Egyptian complicity in the siege of Gaza. This is enormously unpopular, obviously, throughout the Arab world. I think we will see upheavals here and there produced by this. As I've said, I think there will be many wide ripples from this event, the beginning of which we have seen. But this is the end of the beginning, as has been said, and we're now going to see a slaughter in Gaza, with, I think, probably huge Israeli casualties as well as Palestinian. So the effects of this are going to be huge on a regional level. And I would note also, by the way, that the Palestinians have been, fairly restrained. Historically, as Joseph said, I think they've understood that while under international law, settlement activity that's conducted for a military purpose, which is explicitly what a lot of the settlements were established for by the Israelis, makes it legitimate to attack those settlements. And yet this has not been the case. I think the Palestinians have wisely recognized the political implications of doing that and refrained largely until now. We'll see what happens now.
I know it's very difficult to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Can you make any prognosis about how things may play out, and what would you think are going to be some of the outcomes of what's going on? See, there is a phenomenon that is totally now taken out of context, and it should really be part of this context, and that is Arab Street. Where is the phenomenon of Arab Street? Under lack of democracy, Arab Street was the only expression of how people reacted to their governments. And I don't suppose that these Arab Street are going to remain totally oblivious or can be suppressed. They're going to be definitely a reaction.
Jordan is a majority Palestinian country. And we've been talking about Egypt, where I think the reactions will be strong. But I think we also have to look at Jordan. Of course, there is a possibility that if the conflict between Israel and Lebanon in the Shabbat Farm area spreads, that Syria might become engaged also. The possibilities of a wider war really should concern us. And I note that, one of the reasons for the apparent effort by the White House to combine the request for aid to Ukraine and to Israel is that we're out of ammunition. We are really running short. And I think the ramifications for us are going to be great. I think this increases the danger of Mr. Trump returning to office. I think the domestic American political effects will be profound. And they're somewhat unpredictable because Mr. Netanyahu very stupidly made the relationship with Israel largely a partisan issue. So it's on an unsteady basis now.
If I could follow up with a question here, thinking in terms of the uncertainties of a number of countries that have authoritarian governments that have ties to the United States, the danger of this escalating, bringing in others. How do we understand the possible role of that aircraft carrier fleet that the United States has dispatched, and how do we see these dangers? I mean, I know in the past, in Middle East wars, the United States has moved to nuclear threats, in part to keep the Russians out. The Russians can't come in very hard with Ukraine. But I'd be curious how you see the possibility of a more direct U.S. intervention.
I think it's slight, and I think this aircraft carrier deployment is essentially an irrelevant symbolic act of support for Israel. It has no military utility at all. And in fact, it's probably a very risky maneuver because the identification of the United States with Israel in the forthcoming assault on Gaza justifies an attack on American shipping. So that is also a somewhat explosive issue, but I think it's basically not very significant.
I would say, though, that there is some real considerations that have to be given to the U.S. bases in the region.
Yes.
The biggest U.S. bases, of course, in Qatar and Bahrain. Yeah, go ahead, Chaz.
No, I agree with you.
But I think that what that leads to, I don't think we know. Those are not governments that have any commitment to Palestinian rights. They do have a big commitment to maintaining their good ties with the U.S. military.
Right.
So, when we look at who's going to benefit from this, certainly the arms producers are. What Chaz said is very important about the reductions in stockpiles, but the solution to that is more money from the U.S. federal budget will go to the military. We already spend 53 cents of every discretionary federal dollar going directly to the U.S. military, the majority of which, half of which at least, goes directly to the producers. And that's not including the 100 billion or so total money that has gone so far to Ukraine, about 60 billion of which is military. So all of that goes to the question of what's going to be the impact on people in this country, what that means for the elections, what it means for poor people. All those things have to be taken into account.
You know that our politicians will not raise taxes to pay for the additional expenses. If they did, there would be a backlash. We borrow $1.5 trillion each year just to keep the government running at the level, which is a very unsatisfactory level at which it runs. We have decaying infrastructure. We have a rapidly deteriorating educational system. We have a public health system, which is an international disgrace, and many other problems, racism and so on, which are not going addressed because we don't have the money. So if we assign priority to aid to Israel and Ukraine, as we have, we get a backlash, and you can see that in the populist right-wing of the Republican Party.
Well, already Republicans are voicing concerns about giving aid to Ukraine. I wonder if they would do the same about aid to Israel. But there is one missing variable in our discussion, and this may need to have a special program on this because we're running out of time. The Russians are only 50 kilometers away, so to speak, from where the aircraft carrier and to what extent any war that would expand might involve Syria, how would the Russians be involved in this?
I don't think the Russians want to get involved in this at all. I know that the Arab League has sent a delegation to Moscow to talk about this, but I don't think the Russian fleet at Texas will do anything. And in fact, the Russian behavior in Syria has been a splendid example of minimal military investment for maximum diplomatic gain. I think we're dealing with people in Moscow who may be demonized, but who are pretty smart and sophisticated about how they deploy power. And I don't think they want to get in the middle of this. And this would be true even if roughly a fifth of Israelis weren't really Russians pretending to be Israelis.
All right. I know we're coming to end of this program, and given the richness of this discussion and the expertise that we have around the table here, I think this is an invitation to look at another subsequent program to deal with. But is there any ending word before we end this program that you would like to share with our audience?
Well, I think the obvious piece is that we have to do everything that we can to influence our government, and as we relate to others as well, to push for a ceasefire and negotiations which will affirm the rights of Palestinians. And over the long term, if that can be done, will also reinforce the security of Israelis. But first and foremost, we have to work for a peace that respects the rights of Palestinians who've been absolutely trampled on, the need for education, the need to push back against what's going to be huge pressure on the rest of us, for being critical of Israel in the context of the war.
I would just add to that the critical word is context. That this is not about justifying any particular act of violence. Many of those acts did violate international law. It means understanding the context in which they occur, why they occur, what gives rise to that kind of violence, and how do we stop that? That's what our obligation has to include.
I will just close by noting that all this is extremely sensible. Joseph, I agree with you completely. But you need to bear in mind that Congressman Markey was just booed off the stage in Boston for arguing for a ceasefire. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, retracted a tweet in which he had advocated a ceasefire, so that the United States is now entirely behind what I think, is a transparently genocidal attack on Gaza. So one should not, I don't think this excuses us from advocacy of what is right, but I think we need to recognize that the prospects of success are very low.
But we cannot remain silent, and we have to do what we can. Well,
it is a good point to end this fantastic discussion. Thank you very much for being part of it, and I hope you would accept that we come back again for another round and many rounds. I mean, with your knowledge, expertise, and experience, and your commitments to peace and dignity of the human beings, Palestinians or anybody, is itself a mark of your excellence and your commitments to peace. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.